The executive order landed on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 pages, blunt language, no prior consultation with Congress, no warning to industry, and no 60-day negotiation period required under the framework's own Article 22. Donald Trump accused Canada of failing to demonstrate adequate commitment to American economic priorities. He said Canadian leaders had exploited the agreement to undermine U.S. trade interests and resist legitimate American security requirements. Then he gave Canada 72 hours to vacate every joint coordination office, terminate every shared regulatory process, and sever every integrated customs system that had processed more than $2 billion in cross-border trade every single day for over 3 decades. For context, this framework was not a simple trade deal. It was the operating system of the continental economy, built incrementally over 31 years, across 6 administrations of both parties. It governed how energy flows, how intelligence is shared, how critical minerals move, how defense procurement operates, and how the most productive bilateral economic relationship on Earth actually functions. It worked so well that most Americans forgot it was even there, and Trump just erased it. Within hours, international law scholars condemned the unilateral termination. A former UN Secretary General called it the most significant abrogation of a bilateral treaty by a major democracy in the post-war era. 31 nations issued formal statements of concern, not because they cared about the US-Canada framework specifically, but because every country with an American bilateral agreement now had to ask, if the United States tears up a 31-year partnership with its closest ally in 72 hours, what is any American agreement actually worth? But the real consequences did not arrive in diplomatic notes. They arrived on power grids, assembly lines, and grocery store shelves. Start with energy. Under the framework, Canada supplied 61% of all crude oil imported by the United States, 38% of natural gas imports in northern states, and 97% of electricity imports for border communities from Maine to Washington state. The framework's grid synchronization protocols allowed power to flow seamlessly across the border, balancing loads during peak demand and preventing blackouts during extreme weather. That synchronization was terminated by executive order. Not reduced, not renegotiated, terminated. Within 48 hours, grid operators in New England, the Upper Midwest, and the Pacific Northwest activated emergency protocols they had never used outside simulation exercises. The reason? Forecasters were already calling for one of the coldest winters in 15 years. New England, which relied on Quebec hydroelectric imports for peak demand management through every winter of the framework's history, suddenly faced November with 11% less grid capacity than the previous year. Natural gas prices in the upper Midwest surged 43% within 10 days as pipeline flow agreements reverted from stable framework terms to volatile spot market pricing. The governor of Michigan held a press conference in front of an auto plant that had already reduced shifts due to energy cost spikes. He said, and I quote, "We are watching the president dismantle the economic foundation of this region in real time. The framework wasn't a Canadian benefit. It was an American lifeline, and we just cut it ourselves." Then came critical minerals. Canada is the primary or sole North American source of nickel, cobalt, potash, uranium, lithium, and 17 of the 23 rare earth elements that the Pentagon classifies as essential to national defense. Under the framework's supply chain provisions, American defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics had guaranteed priority access at stable, pre-negotiated prices. Without the framework, those minerals are now available on the open market, where China controls 67% of global rare earth processing, and where prices are set not by bilateral agreement, but by whoever is willing to pay the most. A Department of Defense internal memo leaked within the first week warned that the termination created an immediate vulnerability in 7 active weapons procurement programs and introduced unacceptable supply chain risk to multiple major defense platforms. The memo recommended immediate emergency engagement with Canadian authorities. In other words, ask Canada to voluntarily restore, at Canada's discretion and Canada's price, access that America had just unilaterally revoked. A senior Canadian trade official speaking anonymously said, "They kicked us out on Monday. They're asking us back on Friday. But the price has changed. The auto industry collapse hit the fastest and hardest. The backbone of manufacturing in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee was built on framework integration so deep that a single vehicle crosses the US-Canada border an average of 7 times during production. Engines made in Ontario go to assembly plants in Michigan. Transmissions built in Indiana use Canadian aluminum. Wiring harnesses assembled in Quebec. Trucks run on Canadian diesel." The framework's regulatory harmonization meant these crossings happened seamlessly. Same safety standards, same emissions certification, same customs processing. The executive order shattered that integration overnight. Every crossing now requires independent inspection, separate certification, new customs documentation, and compliance with two divergent regulatory systems. The Auto Alliance estimated the cost at $11,000 per vehicle, adding an average of $900 to the price of every car and truck sold in the United States within 6 months. Within 2 weeks, 3 major assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio announced temporary shutdowns. Ford issued a statement calling the framework termination the most significant disruption to North American automotive manufacturing since the pandemic. General Motors estimated a per-vehicle cost increase of $12,000 if the framework was not restored within 90 days. The United Auto Workers said, "Our members are being sent home because the president decided to blow up the system that kept their plants running. These aren't layoffs. These are casualties of a policy nobody asked for, nobody wanted, and nobody can survive." Here's where the story changes from a trade dispute into a strategic catastrophe. Inside the framework, Canada was constrained. Exclusivity provisions prevented Canada from signing preferential trade agreements with non-members. Regulatory harmonization locked Canadian standards to American specifications. Energy integration committed Canadian supply to American demand at prices consistently below global market rates. The framework was, from Canada's perspective, a ceiling as much as a floor. Trump tore up the ceiling. The moment the executive order took effect, every constraint that had kept Canada locked into American favorable terms vanished. Canadian oil, previously committed to U.S. refineries at framework rates, was now available to the highest global bidder. And the highest global bidder was not the United States. Canadian critical minerals were now available to European and Asian manufacturers willing to pay 30 to 40% more. Canadian ports were free to restructure operations around whichever trading partners offered the best terms. Within 1 week, Canada signed provisional trade memoranda with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. The EU agreement alone fast-tracked through emergency provisions, opening European markets to Canadian energy exports at prices 22% above what American buyers had been paying. Japan's Ministry of Economy announced a $2.3 billion investment in Canadian rare earth processing facilities, exactly the kind of investment that framework exclusivity had previously blocked. India signed a critical minerals partnership for Canadian lithium and cobalt, commodities that American battery manufacturers had assumed were exclusively theirs. The cage had kept the bird inside. Trump opened the cage, and the bird didn't sit on the perch waiting to be invited back. It flew to markets that valued it more. Then Mark Carney responded, not with the cold strategic precision of his previous counter-tariff announcements. Something else. Something that millions recognized as the sound of a leader who had moved past calculation into conviction. He stood before a joint session of the Canadian Parliament, convened on emergency notice, with diplomatic representatives from 23 nations in the visitors' gallery. No notes, quiet voice, absolutely steady. He spoke first to Canadians. 31 years ago, Canada entered into a framework with the United States based on a simple principle: that two nations could build something together that neither could build alone. For 31 years, that principle held. Canadian energy powered American homes. Canadian minerals built American weapons. Canadian workers assembled American cars. Canadian ports moved American goods. Canadian intelligence protected American cities. We did this not as subordinates, but as partners. Then he turned to the camera. To the President of the United States, you have expelled Canada from a framework that Canada helped build, that Canada sustained, and that Canada's resources made valuable. You did this believing it would bring us to our knees. You did this because you confused our partnership with your leverage. He stopped. The silence was total. Then 7 words spoken with the finality of a door closing and a lock turning. You didn't remove us. You removed yourself. The chamber erupted. The ovation lasted over 90 seconds. Within 6 minutes, the phrase was trending globally. Within 30 minutes, it was the lead story on every major news network in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The Financial Times ran it as a banner headline. Japan's NHK interrupted programming. International media called it the 7 words that inverted a superpower. Warren Buffett did not talk about politics. He talked about a pattern he has watched destroy partnerships for 70 years. Most mistakes are recoverable, he said. Bad strategy can be corrected. Poor execution can be improved. But there is one mistake that is not recoverable: firing a partner who was doing more for you than you were doing for them. Because the moment that partner is free, 2 things happen. First, they discover what they're actually worth on the open market, and it is always more than what you were paying them. Second, you discover what they were actually providing, and it is always more than what you thought. Buffett applied it directly. The framework was the most lopsided deal in modern economic history. Lopsided in America's favor, Canada was providing energy below global market rates. minerals below global market rates, integrated manufacturing labor below any alternative cost, and the United States was receiving all of it while believing it was doing Canada a favor. That is the most dangerous delusion in business, believing you are the benefactor when you are in fact the beneficiary. His closing was devastating. People ask me whether Canada will come back. The question isn't whether Canada will come back. The question is whether Canada will want to. Before the expulsion, Canada had one major trading partner. After the expulsion, Canada has the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and a line of nations stretching around the world, all offering better terms than America ever did. Trump didn't kick Canada out of the framework. He kicked America out of the best deal it ever had. Within 3 weeks, 14 governors, 9 Republicans and 5 Democrats, signed a joint letter to the White House demanding emergency framework restoration, calling the expulsion an act of economic self-sabotage. 37 senators, including 11 Republicans, co-sponsored an emergency resolution requiring congressional approval for any future unilateral termination of bilateral frameworks. The Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Petroleum Institute, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a joint statement, the first time all 4 had co-signed a single document in over a decade, calling the framework termination catastrophic, unnecessary, and immediately reversible if the political will existed. Public opinion moved with striking clarity. Polling showed 64% of Americans, including 41% of Republicans, opposed the expulsion. 73% of respondents in border states directly affected by energy disruptions and auto plant shutdowns opposed it. And when asked who benefited from the framework termination, only 11% said the United States. 67% said Canada. The American public had arrived at the same conclusion as Buffett, the markets, the allies, and the governors. Trump hadn't punished Canada. He had set them free. Can the United States replace 61% of its crude oil imports, 97% of its border electricity, and the critical minerals its military depends on? From where?